Picture this, September 26, 1983. It's 11:15 p.m. in Moscow. A young Soviet air defense officer named Stanislav Petrov sits in a darkened bunker called Serpukov 15, staring at a computer screen that's about to show him something that will test every fiber of his being. He's responsible for monitoring Soviet early warning satellites, the system designed to detect incoming American nuclear missiles. His job is simple. If America launches, he reports it. If he reports it, Soviet missiles fly. If Soviet missiles fly, humanity ends. That's not hyperbole. That's the actual weight sitting on his shoulders in that moment. The sirens start wailing. Red lights flash across his console. The computer screen blazes with the most terrifying words in the military lexicon: launch detected. Five. They're tracking across the radar. They're closing in. The time to impact is somewhere around 15 to 20 minutes. This is it. This is the moment that generals train for, that politicians pray never comes, that ordinary people have nightmares about. An American nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. But here's what makes Stanislav Petrov different from every other man who's ever sat in that chair. He didn't believe it. In those next few minutes, while alarms screamed and every military regulation screamed at him to escalate, to report the attack to his superiors, to trigger the Soviet response protocol that would send hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles toward American cities. A decision more consequential than the Cuban Missile Crisis, a decision that might have literally saved the world. He decided to report it as a false alarm. He picked up his phone and told his superiors it was a mistake, it was a computer glitch. The Americans weren't attacking, everyone should calm down. He said this with no certainty, with no proof, with only his gut feeling and his understanding of how American military doctrine actually worked. And he said it knowing that if he was wrong, he would be responsible for the deaths of potentially hundreds of millions of people. If he was wrong, when Soviet missiles flew and American missiles flew in response, the sky would fill with nuclear fire and civilization would end. This is the story of Stanislav Petrov. This is the story of how one man's skepticism, one man's willingness to trust his instincts over the machine screaming at him, how one man's refusal to follow orders exactly as given, might be the reason you're alive right now to watch this video. And the scariest part? Almost nobody knows about it. The Cuban Missile Crisis gets movies and documentaries. JFK gets remembered for staring down Khrushchev. But Stanislav Petrov sits in obscurity, a man who single-handedly prevented World War III and whose name most people have never heard. Until 2010, the Soviet and Russian governments denied the incident even happened. For 27 years, this man who saved the world couldn't even tell people what he'd done. Let's understand the context first, because you need to feel the temperature of the Cold War in 1983 to understand how genuinely close to nuclear war humanity actually was. This wasn't the stable Cold War of the 1970s. This was a Cold War on the edge of something catastrophic. Ronald Reagan had just come into office in America, and Reagan believed in American military supremacy. He talked about the Soviet Union as an evil empire. He pushed for massive military build-ups. He authorized the deployment of cruise missiles in Western Europe aimed directly at Soviet targets. From the Soviet perspective, Reagan looked like a warmonger, like a man who might actually use nuclear weapons. Their leadership, including an aging Yuri Andropov, who was dying from kidney disease, genuinely believed that America might launch a preemptive strike to destroy Soviet military capability. They believed that Reagan might start a nuclear war and think they could survive it. This wasn't paranoia. This was the actual strategic thinking of the time. Both sides had developed doctrines of nuclear war that assumed you could fight and win a nuclear conflict. Both sides had massive arsenals. Both sides had their fingers on the trigger. In March 1983, Reagan gave a speech where he called the Soviet Union an evil empire. Days later, he announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to build a shield against Soviet missiles. The Soviets saw this as an act of aggression. They saw it as America preparing to dominate them militarily. The tension escalated month by month through the spring and summer. Intelligence reports flew back and forth. The military-industrial complexes on both sides were roaring. Defense budgets were climbing. Rhetoric was heating up. Every statement from Reagan sounded more militant. Every response from Moscow sounded more desperate. By September, NATO was conducting a military exercise called Able Archer 83. This was a command post exercise where NATO practiced nuclear war scenarios. The Soviets watched this exercise happening. They watched Western military officials moving around, conducting simulations of nuclear conflict, and they became convinced that this wasn't a simulation. They became convinced that this was actually the beginning of a real NATO attack being disguised as an exercise. It was a form of paranoia, but it was the kind of paranoia that made sense given the geopolitical reality of the moment. When you believe your enemy is aggressive and militant, when you believe they're building weapons to attack you, when you watch them practice attacking you in an exercise, it's not hard to convince yourself that the exercise might suddenly become real. So, when Stanislav Petrov sat down at his console on September 26, 1983, he was sitting in a bunker where the military command structure was on high alert. People were watching. Everyone was expecting something to happen. There was an almost electric quality to the tension. The machine itself seemed to sense it. The system Petrov was monitoring, called Oko, was supposedly the most advanced early warning system in the Soviet arsenal. It was designed to detect American missile launches almost instantly. It had never made a major error. It was trusted. Officers like Petrov had been trained to believe in the system. They'd been trained to understand that when the system reported a launch, the system was probably right. Until that night. Five missiles detected. This was the data. This was the computer doing what it was supposed to do. Report American attack. Escalate immediately. Get the chain of command involved. Get the missiles ready. The entire protocol was designed to move fast because in a nuclear war, speed is life. If you wait too long to respond, your missiles get destroyed on the ground before they can launch. So the system is built for hair-trigger response. Decision time, measured in minutes. Verification time, almost non-existent. The pressure is enormous because everyone knows that hesitation in a nuclear exchange could mean catastrophic losses. Petrov had a few minutes to report this up the chain of command. His job wasn't to verify the attack, his job was to report it. The verification would happen at higher levels, but those higher levels would be looking at the same data he was seeing. Those higher levels would be seeing American attack detected, and they would be moving toward activation of the Soviet nuclear response protocol. The generals would be scrambling, the politicians would be getting briefed, the missiles would be getting ready to launch. The whole machinery of nuclear war would begin turning. But Stanislav Petrov thought about something. He thought about how nuclear strategy actually works. If America was going to attack the Soviet Union, they would do it with everything they had. They would launch thousands of missiles, not 5. 5 missiles wouldn't destroy Soviet retaliatory capability. 5 missiles wouldn't make any military sense whatsoever. 5 missiles would be like throwing a pebble at a fortress. Any strategic planner would know this. Any American general would know that launching just 5 missiles would only guarantee a massive Soviet retaliation. So why would America do it? Why would they deliberately trigger their own destruction? They wouldn't. The strategy doesn't make sense. The math doesn't work. And he thought about the Americans. Did he really believe that on this particular day, the Americans had decided to start nuclear war? Did that make sense given what he knew about American leadership? Did that make sense given how American strategic doctrine worked? Did it make sense that they would do it in this particular way, with this particular number of missiles, at this particular time? The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. Petrov looked at the data more carefully. He looked at the satellite that was reporting the detections. He realized something. The satellite had a history of false alarms. It had malfunctioned before. The data wasn't consistent in ways it should be, if it was real. The signal quality was strange. The pattern wasn't matching what a real attack should look like, and he made a judgment call. He decided that the probability of this being a real attack was lower than the probability of it being a malfunction. The computer said missiles were coming. His brain said the computer was wrong. So he called his commanding officer and said it was a false alarm. Think about this for a second. Think about the implications. Think about what would have happened if he was wrong. If those 5 missiles were real, if America really was attacking, then by saying it was a false alarm, Petrov would be directly responsible for the failure to launch a Soviet response. He would be responsible for allowing American missiles to impact Soviet targets. He would be directly responsible for allowing American military superiority to go unchecked. From a military perspective, if he was wrong, he would be a traitor. He would be the man who lost the nuclear war through his inaction. He would be remembered, if anyone survived to remember anything, as the man who destroyed the Soviet Union through his incompetence. But if he was right, if it was a false alarm, then he was the man who prevented nuclear war by refusing to escalate based on computer data that looked scary but wasn't real. He would be a hero, except nobody would know about it. The incident would be classified. It would be hidden away. The world would keep spinning, and most people would never know they were saved. He was betting his life, his career, and the fate of humanity on his judgment of what the computer was telling him versus what reality actually was. He was making a choice that could go one of 2 ways. He could be a hero nobody knows about, or he could be a traitor. Nobody remembers because everyone is dead. Those are the only 2 outcomes. There's no middle ground. There's no third option where he's wrong, but nobody dies anyway. Nuclear war isn't a game where you get partial credit. It's all or nothing, win or lose, live or die. The officer knew Petrov. Petrov had a reputation for being careful and precise. The officer also understood military doctrine. The officer understood that if this went up the chain of command, and it was a false alarm, there would be international incidents. There would be tensions ratcheted up. The Americans might respond to reports of Soviet alert status. But if Petrov was wrong and they didn't escalate, there would be something far worse. 1,000 times worse. So the officer was taking a risk too. The officer was choosing to trust a subordinate's judgment over a machine's warning. The officer was saying, "I believe you more than I believe the computer." Other sensors didn't show the missiles. The radar data didn't match. The missile trajectories weren't appearing on secondary systems. Minutes passed. The window closed. No American missiles struck the Soviet Union. No war started. The world continued to exist. What actually happened was a satellite malfunction. The computer that processes satellite data had glitched. The system was looking at the sun, reflecting off clouds, and interpreting it as missile launches. It was a false positive caused by a computer error. Exactly what Petrov suspected. The machine had made a mistake. The machine had seen something that looked like a threat and reported it as a threat. And because a human being had the wisdom and the courage to question whether the machine was right, the false alarm didn't cascade into nuclear war. The all-clear was eventually given. The morning sun came up on a world that didn't know how close it had come to ending. People in New York went to work. People in Moscow went to work. Children went to school. Families had dinner. Nobody knew that civilization had nearly ended. Nobody knew that they'd all almost died. Nobody knew the name of the man who saved them. Petrov went home that night. He didn't get celebrated. He didn't get a medal. He didn't get recognized in any way. The incident was classified. The Soviet Union denied it happened. The whole thing was locked away in classified files. Petrov went back to his regular job. He eventually retired from the military. He moved to Kiev. He lived a quiet life as a military pensioner. He was living proof of something that should terrify and comfort us at the same time, that our survival depends on individuals making good judgment calls in moments of extreme pressure, and that we might never know who those individuals are. For 27 years, nobody knew his name. Nobody knew what he'd done. The world kept spinning, and Stanislav Petrov walked around as an anonymous man with one of the greatest secrets in human history locked inside his head. He couldn't talk about it. The government wouldn't acknowledge it happened. If he'd told people what he'd done, he probably would have been dismissed as delusional or lying. Instead, he stayed quiet. He lived his life. He was a ghost in the machine of history. The thing that makes this story even more significant is what it reveals about how close humanity actually was to nuclear war, and how many times we were probably saved by people making judgment calls rather than following protocols. When you look at the historical record, when you look at declassified documents from both the American and Soviet sides, you realize that 1983 was probably the closest to nuclear war that the world has ever come since 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was a situation where both Kennedy and Khrushchev were actively trying to find the way out. They were in communication. They were working the problem. They were showing wisdom and restraint. There was nobody picking up a red phone and trying to talk it down. There was just the system, and the system was designed to escalate fast. There was just military officers watching screens and making split-second decisions about whether to end the world. What makes Petrov's decision even more remarkable is that he made it with incomplete information. He didn't have certainty. He couldn't be sure. He was making a judgment call based on analysis and intuition, and his understanding of strategy and psychology. In military terms, that's called judgment under uncertainty, and it's exactly the kind of thinking that military hierarchies are designed to prevent. The whole point of military command structure is to remove judgment from the equation. Orders come from the top. They're followed. Individual soldiers and officers don't get to decide whether orders make sense. They get to follow them. That's how militaries maintain discipline and control. But Petrov didn't follow the order implicit in the machine. The machine was essentially ordering him to escalate. The machine was saying, "Threat detected, report immediately, escalate now." And Petrov said, "I'm not going to do that because I don't think the threat is real." He was refusing to obey the machine's command because he thought the machine was wrong, and that insubordination might have saved civilization. The implications of this should terrify you and simultaneously give you a sense of how fragile human civilization actually is. We built these massive nuclear systems. We automated them. We made them as efficient as possible. We created protocols that would respond to threats in microseconds. We removed human decision-making from the loop because we thought humans were too slow, too emotional, too likely to make mistakes. We built machines that could make decisions faster than any human could. We thought that was safer. We thought that was better. But what Stanislav Petrov demonstrated is that the machines could make mistakes too. And when the machine makes a mistake and humans have removed themselves from the decision-making loop, there's nothing to catch the error except other humans making judgment calls about whether the machine is right. In the case of Petrov, the machine was wrong. And because Petrov was still in the loop, because he was still watching, because he still had the ability to make a judgment call, the error didn't cascade into nuclear war. If the system had been fully automated, if it had escalated immediately without human input, if Petrov had just been a data entry clerk pressing buttons based on what the computer told him to do, there might have been a Soviet response launched. That response would have triggered an American counter-response, and in minutes the nuclear exchange would have begun. This is the hidden history of the Cold War that most people don't understand. The United States and the Soviet Union came much closer to nuclear war than public discourse acknowledged. There were multiple incidents where early warning systems gave false alerts. There were multiple times when military officers had to make judgment calls about whether threats were real. Most of those incidents are still classified. Most of the people who made those decisions are never identified. But they exist. They're part of the historical record. They're part of the reason we're all still here. Stanislav Petrov was unique, not because he made a judgment call in a nuclear crisis. Other officers made similar judgment calls at different times, but because the incident happened to become public. Because eventually the Soviet Union collapsed. Because eventually declassification happened. Because eventually a journalist discovered the story and put it in front of the world. Because sometimes, for reasons we can't fully control or predict, the truth comes out. In 2010, the Russian government officially acknowledged that the incident had happened. Petrov was finally able to talk publicly about it. He gave interviews to historians and journalists. He spoke at conferences. He became known to people interested in Cold War history. The world learned the name of the man who stopped World War III. He was interviewed by documentary filmmakers. He was written about in history books. He became real instead of remaining anonymous. He lived for several more years after his story became public, continuing to speak about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the importance of human judgment in military decision-making. He talked about how close we came. He talked about how fragile the systems are that keep us safe. He talked about the importance of skepticism and the willingness to question authority. He died in 2019, just shy of his 88th birthday. On his deathbed, he was thinking about nuclear war, about the risks humanity faced, about the fragility of the systems that protected us from destruction. The ultimate lesson of Stanislav Petrov's story is this: we survive, not because our systems are perfect, but because humans within those systems sometimes have the wisdom to question the systems when they seem wrong. We survive because of judgment, intuition, skepticism, and the willingness to trust your gut, even when powerful machines are screaming at you that you should do something different. And we also survive because of luck, because the malfunction happened the way it happened. Because Petrov was the officer on duty, instead of someone who would have followed the protocol more strictly. Because the Soviet command structure allowed for the possibility that their early warning system could be wrong. Because 1,000 other things aligned in ways that prevented catastrophe. There's a profound humility in that realization. We built nuclear weapons thinking we were securing ourselves. We spent trillions of dollars. We built elaborate systems. We created protocols and procedures and hierarchies. We did all of this to keep ourselves safe. But what actually secures us is the possibility that at the moment of crisis, a human being will have the courage to say, "Wait, I don't think this is real," and that the system will allow him to do that. The world came closer to ending in September 1983 than most people realize. And we kept going because one man in one bunker in Moscow decided to trust his judgment over a machine. He decided that the machine might be wrong. He decided that his understanding of human nature and military strategy might be right. He made a bet. And we all got to keep living because of it.